the Halifax Explosion. At 9:04 in the morning, thousands of people in Halifax were watching a burning ship. They had no idea they were looking at a bomb. The ship was carrying thousands of tons of explosives, and for almost 20 minutes, people stood along the waterfront watching it burn. Then, at exactly 9:04 and 35 seconds, the ship exploded. And in less than a second, one of the most devastating explosions in history tore through Halifax. People point toward it from the shoreline. A period clock approaches 9:04 a.m. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the morning of December 6, 1917. Halifax was a busy wartime port. The First World War was raging in Europe, and Halifax had become one of the most important departure points for ships carrying soldiers, supplies, and ammunition across the Atlantic. The harbor was crowded with ships. Railway lines connected the waterfront to the rest of Canada, and thousands of civilians lived close to the docks.
That morning, two ships were entering the narrows of Halifax Harbour. One was the French cargo ship SS Mont-Blanc. The other was the Norwegian vessel SS Imo. The Mont-Blanc was not an ordinary cargo ship. Hidden inside its holds was an enormous cargo of explosives and other highly flammable materials destined for the war in Europe. The ship was carrying explosives, including picric acid, TNT, gun cotton, and benzol. It was essentially a floating arsenal.
But almost nobody on the shore knew what was inside. Then the two ships began moving toward each other. The harbor was crowded. The ships were maneuvering in a confined stretch of water, and despite attempts to avoid one another, the two vessels collided. The collision itself was not the catastrophe. The Mont-Blanc survived, but the collision damaged the ship and started a fire, and that fire was heading directly toward its cargo. The crew of the Mont-Blanc knew exactly how dangerous the situation was. They abandoned the ship. The burning vessel was left drifting toward the Halifax waterfront. And now something extraordinary happened. People came outside to watch. Workers stopped what they were doing. People gathered along the waterfront. Others watched from the windows of nearby buildings. The burning ship had become a spectacle, but the people watching did not know what was inside it. Some people who understood the danger tried to warn others, but there was no way to evacuate everyone in time. The ship continued burning. Minute after minute, the fire grew. Smoke filled the sky, and the distance between the burning ship and the city continued to shrink. For nearly 20 minutes, the fire burned. Then the situation became irreversible. At approximately 9:04 in the morning, the Mont-Blanc exploded. The explosion was enormous. The blast ripped through the surrounding area. Buildings collapsed. Windows shattered across Halifax. Debris was thrown through the streets. People who had been watching the ship only moments earlier were suddenly caught in the blast. The explosion was so powerful that it could be felt for miles. A huge column of smoke rose above the harbor. The waterfront was devastated, and the destruction did not end with the initial blast. The explosion also generated a powerful wave that swept into parts of Halifax and Dartmouth. Buildings near the waterfront were destroyed or severely damaged. Ships were damaged or thrown from their positions. The landscape people had known only minutes earlier had been transformed. But inside the chaos, one story stands out. A railway telegraph operator named Vincent Coleman was working near the waterfront. When the danger became obvious, he sent a warning through the railway telegraph system.
His message urgently operating a telegraph key while smoke fills the distance outside. His message warned incoming trains to stop because an ammunition ship was about to explode. Coleman understood that trains were still approaching Halifax, and he stayed at his station long enough to send the warning. The message helped prevent additional trains from entering the disaster zone, but Coleman did not survive the explosion. He was among the thousands whose lives were changed in those few seconds.
When the smoke began to clear, Halifax was almost unrecognizable.
The explosion had killed nearly 2,000 people. Around 9,000 were injured. Thousands of homes were damaged or destroyed. About 6,000 people were left without proper shelter. Hospitals were overwhelmed,
and survivors wandered through streets filled with broken glass, debris, and smoke. But the disaster was about to become even harder. The day after the explosion, a major snowstorm struck Halifax. The storm brought freezing temperatures and heavy snow. People who had lost their homes now faced winter conditions without adequate shelter.
Yet help began arriving. Medical teams and supplies were sent from other parts of Canada and the United States. Boston responded particularly strongly. Doctors, nurses, medical supplies, and financial assistance were sent north to Halifax. The connection between Boston and Halifax would last for generations. Every Christmas, Halifax sends Boston a Christmas tree as a gesture of gratitude for the help Boston provided after the disaster.
But while Halifax began rebuilding, another question remained. Who was responsible? The collision between the Mont-Blanc and Imo had caused the fire, but the legal battle that followed examined much more than the collision. Investigators had to determine how the ships entered the Narrows, who had the right of way, and whether anyone had acted negligently. The collision became the subject of a lengthy legal investigation.
Responsibility was disputed. The disaster also exposed the enormous danger created when explosive cargo was moved through a crowded urban harbor. The Mont-Blanc had been carrying a cargo intended for a world war, but the ship had brought that danger directly into the heart of a city. The Halifax explosion changed the city permanently. Entire neighborhoods had to be rebuilt. Thousands of people were injured. Thousands more lost homes or loved ones.
And the disaster became one of the defining tragedies of Canada's wartime history. But there is another reason the Halifax explosion remains so important. It demonstrated how quickly an ordinary sequence of events can become cataclysmic. Two ships entered a narrow harbor. They collided. One caught fire. People gathered to watch. The fire reached the cargo. And 20 minutes later, a city was devastated. There was no warning siren that could save everyone.
There was no time for a citywide evacuation, and there was no way for the people watching from the shore to understand what was coming. They saw a burning ship. They did not see the thousands of tons of explosives inside it. At 9:04 and 35 seconds, that changed. The explosion released an enormous amount of energy in an instant. The shockwave tore through Halifax. The waterfront disappeared beneath smoke and debris, and thousands of ordinary people became victims of a disaster that had begun with two ships trying to navigate a harbor. Today, the Halifax explosion is remembered not simply as a massive blast. It is remembered as a warning about what happens when enormous destructive forces are brought into close proximity with ordinary civilian life. The people who watched the Mont-Blanc burn could not have known what they were seeing. They were watching a countdown. They just didn't know it was a countdown. For nearly 20 minutes, the fire grew. At 9:04 and 35 seconds, the countdown ended, and Halifax was changed forever.